All right, in this video we're going to pick up where we abruptly left off on the last video because I hit stop instead of pause, so I apologize for that. So now we have two videos instead of one. And this was the result of what we did in exercise 1 for chapter 13. So we were successfully able to get this up on the screen. You guys will notice that if we try to refresh it and scramble these, it doesn't work, and we can't drag and drop anything yet. Those are things we're still building, but we got the interface basically built. And I think it looks pretty good considering how simplistic it is. All right, so let's move on now. So we're going to move on to exercise 2. We're in the middle of page 526. And then what that's going to have us do is get into that document ready function that we were just working with. And we're going to start adding some things in here that are going to allow for drag and drop to actually start working for us. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm going to copy the code in 2 fell swoops. So there's 3 lines on 526 that I'm going to drop in, and then I'm going to grab some from page 527, and then let's talk about them afterwards. All right, so now you're noticing that we're using our jQuery selectors here, that $sign. And we're, on all of these, we're selecting the game board. The game board is the thing that's receiving the attention. And then we're using all of these new, event handlers that are attached to drag and drop that are built into jQuery. And then depending on what we're doing, like where we're, we're starting the drag or ending the drag, or we're entering into a new area or dragging over something, or then we actually let go of that mouse button and drop it. And then each one of those actions, we're setting up a separate method, so drag started, ended, default, and drop, to react to those movements. Okay, that's basically what we're doing here, is we're setting up the event handlers to be able to react to all the different versions of what happens in the drag and drop. Everything from the initial click and move to what happens when we're over something or letting go. So that's really what's happening here. It's not really that complicated. Now we're going to go through and we're going to start building each one of these functions. So I'm going to start grabbing the code. I'm on step number 4. And I'm just going to drag that right to the bottom here. So this is drag started. And I think that might be most efficient here is to actually get some of these in here, and then we can talk about them en masse. So step number 5, we are putting in drag ended. And then prevent default. And these are the main ones that are happening. So let's talk about prevent default first. What is that going to do? What does prevent default do? Well, it doesn't want you to have something trigger when you don't want it to trigger. When you don't want it to trigger is when you're dragging over something. Just because you're dragging over something doesn't mean you want some JavaScript to fire up and do something, right? Sometimes you're just moving something. So prevent default is we're preventing it from dropping and triggering code. And see what this method does, or function does, is it calls itself. To do what? To do nothing. So in other words, when we're looking at these actions here, when we're dragging over a new area or we are over something, we don't want anything to happen, not until we let go of that mouse button. So that's what we're coding with. So that's the easy one. From there, when we actually have determined that the drag is done, so we've moved it somewhere else, and we've let go of the mouse button, then we trigger drag ended. And what is that doing? It's removing the class from the object called drag, which of course is going to keep it from styling a certain way and behaving a certain way. So we're changing its status because it's been moved. In the more complicated one, now we start looking at stuff that's a little bit more sophisticated, and that would be that we're looking at where we're coming from, where we're going to, And then as we're moving something, notice that we're throwing in these little keywords here. So while something is moving, we are actually saying that it's being dragged. Now I could call it something else, but they're intelligently using a name that kind of ties into the action, and I do recommend that because it makes it a little bit easier to follow. And then we are going to be placing it. Now notice these weird things that we created here with the $sign in front. That's still a variable name, folks. It's not jQuery at this point. But it is allowing us to basically take it, and we're dragging it into this other spot and allowing us to release it in that spot and then follow where we're going and change the text relative to where it is. So it's taking whatever our source location is, it's picking it up and changing it to a string, and then allowing us to identify that object by the name that it's given. So it figures out where it's going, like when it gets there. It's kind of like riding a train, and you step off the train and you step into the station, and you realize you're at 42nd Street. Because it says so right inside the train station. That's kind of what's happening here. So we're picking something up, we're moving it, and then when we get there, it takes the identity of where it's going to for its new location. We also have the drop function, which I'm going to drop in last. And that is really not that much different than what's going on here. But you notice that this one's got this little stipulation here. What if you're taking that square to somewhere that's not empty? I mean, there's one empty square on the board, right? But that's telling us that we can kind of drag things. Well, how do these number scramble games work? Can you just pick up a square and move it to anywhere on the board? Where can you move it to? So yeah, somewhere adjacent. Well, that's how the old ones worked. Is that how this one will work? Well, we're going to find out, aren't we? That's part of the fun. And then there's also another method that they're throwing in called move tile. And you can see that one being called here on line 57. And then this is the one that is kind of reacting to how far we're moving. Isn't this kind of interesting? And it sets up some stipulations. So if the distance is less than 0, what does that say? That distance equals negative distance? Is that what it's doing? I want you to think about that one for a second. So what about this one? If distance is equivalent to 1 or the distance is equivalent to 4, what does that indicate? I don't know if you guys noticed the number board, but there's 4 on a row. So if it's position 1, position 4. So if I put 1 in that first position, it's going to displace, but how far is it going to displace? This is kind of like the little conundrum here. So you see, what seems like a really simple little problem actually gets a little bit more complex because you're moving a tile. In order to get that tile in there, it's got to move somewhere. Right? If you're replacing one, where is it going to move to? We can only go from 1 to 4 in a row. So this is allowing us to basically set that parameter. So if we were working with a larger board, let's say it was 8 across, the numbers here would be 1 and 8. Make sense? Let's just leave it at that. All right. Next thing that we want to do is just double check that all of our code is correct. That's what step number 12 is about. And then there's one thing that we are going to add at the bottom of step 12, which is on the next page down, so page 530 at the top. They're adding a function, and it's easy to miss because even though it's bolded, it doesn't look that bolded. But this is kind of like the essence of this thing, is when you do move a tile, not only are you moving it, so the first method here is for moving, but you're also swapping, so you're taking one that's already there And it's got to go somewhere else if you're moving this one. So we need the logic for that too, and that's what's happening on this one. All right, let's go ahead and save this. And then if we're lucky and we run this, and now with that JavaScript fix that we put in, right? Hopefully we are lucky. We should actually be able to take a tile, and you see now that we're actually being able to drag it, how the CSS is kicking in. It turns it red while we're dragging. And then we should be able to move it. Can we? Is it moving the way you thought? Well, we can only move to where it's empty. And can I move from here to here? It's kind of an interesting little problem to solve. And I think they did it pretty elegantly in very little code. So you can only move to an adjacent empty square and no further. It doesn't matter what direction it's in, right? Did you catch that move? You couldn't do that on one of those plastic toys. I couldn't go like this, could I? Right? Let's see if I can use my college degree to figure this out. Oh no, I'm stuck. No, but the one issue that we do have here is the ability to do that, which you could not do with a physical game. All right, so that completes the first two exercises. And then that brings us to the final portion of it, which is to figure out, according to the exercise title, get the scramble to work. How would you suppose you would get that to work? All right, think about it for a second. And then set a way to figure out if you've won or not, right? We got to think about those scenarios. What would indicate that you've won? Yeah, you take all the numbers that are scrambled and you got them in the right order, right? And then how would you scramble them? Yeah, find some way to randomize the way the divs are created so that the numbers aren't placed in order. The loop puts them in an order, but we don't want that. Right, so that sounds pretty simple, and in some ways it kind of is. But what we're going to do here is we are going to, in the document ready function, is we're going to add at the very bottom the scramble. Excuse me. So we're just going to add a method here at the bottom called scramble. We're going to now write in the next step. This is step number 3, page 531. And the scramble function has got a little bit of logic to it. And the author here is using kind of a combination of techniques. So notice that he's running this big loop that goes up to 128. That's pretty big, right? He also is including a randomizer in there. So JavaScript does have a randomizer that you trigger using this command. It's very similar to other languages. We are declaring a variable to indicate where something came from. And then we're running a comparison against whatever random number is generated and testing it to see if it is less than 0.5. Now, unless we're designating how many random numbers are being generated, how many random numbers are being generated? Well, you notice how I'm hovering over random there? And you see what that box says? It's going to generate a random number between 0 and 1. So you would think it would generate from like 0 to 1,000,000, right? But that's not what it does. Everything is between 0 and 1, and then it's a multiplier to make it a whole number or bigger, right? So what they're saying here is that half the time it's going to be less than 0.5 and half the time it's going to be more. So depending on which half, then we start going through some additional logic that basically, if you logic through this, determines where things are going to go automatically. So how would you randomize putting numbers in there? Well, if they were a deck of cards, you would shuffle them, right? But that's not what we're doing here. What we're doing here is we're shuffling, but what are we shuffling? Maybe the location as opposed to the tiles themselves. So as they're being generated, that's when we're changing. And then, of course, in order to swap one tile with the other, we have to run that swap tile and empty square method as well, because that's actually going to do the moving for us. This is just generating the random location. And then once that random location is picked, then it swaps it out. So really what's happening is it's going to create the board, put them in order, and then scramble them. See what I mean? And I can tell you guys have already finished doing the exercise because you're all clicking away, clicking and dragging, trying to make it work and be a winner, right? The other thing that we have to do is in the drop function, which is a little farther up here, we're also going to add an additional function call called check for winner, and that's going to go right before we close it here. So every time, in other words, you pick up a tile and drop it, it checks to see if you've won. Right? That makes sense? And so, of course, then we have to also create that method, which is actually pretty simple, believe it or not. So I'm going to drop this at the bottom. And what that one does is it just checks to see if things are put back where they originally were created. And if that's the case, it throws up a message that says winner. And then we are all very happy. All right, let's go ahead and save this, folks. And let's hit the play button and be brave. Well, that does look scrambled, doesn't it? I'm going to tell you what, I don't trust it scrambling. I'm going to refresh my browser. Did it scramble? Yeah, it did. I'm not liking that it always puts one in the... Oh, there we go. One was always going in that first spot. This looks more random to me. All right, I'm going to record about 20 minutes of video of me trying to fix this, or I mean play this. But this is how the game is played. This is more old school than video games, guys. Oh no. You gotta go this way. Right? Richard's like ready to yell at me for not doing this right here. Because I'm looking beyond the 3 and the 4, thinking about how 5 is going to drop in. No. See, this is where you have to be strategic, folks. It's not even taking me 20 minutes. That's pretty good. Well, this video will be a hit on YouTube. My last row is going to be all messed up. Or is it? Because it allows me to do this, right? Oh, no, it doesn't. All right, well, I want to trigger to see if I got the winner message. You guys get it? You didn't. Maybe you didn't do it right. I've got it one. Now let's see if I get the win message. Proof it can be won. And now it's going out on YouTube. All right, folks, so that actually completes the exercise. Hopefully you guys were successful. And it's kind of fun because at least it's a game, but it kind of gives you ideas. But you know, the most challenging part of putting a game together is that logic for how the mechanics work. And that takes a little bit of time. So in this case, we were kind of given that logic, but it's still fun to experiment both with game logic, simplistic graphics that really aren't graphics. This is all text and HTML. That's kind of what's cool about it too. And most importantly, the drag and drop and how we can trigger code with it. All right, that completes this exercise, and we are done.